Hi, my name's Kim Kaiser. I'm a minister here at the Center for Spiritual Living Santa Rosa, and we are here in our monthly theme of loving kindness and forgiveness, the first week of that, and we're focusing on forgiveness, and we're using the vision of the Centers for Spiritual Living, of which we are a community. And the vision of the Centers for Spiritual Living goes like this. It says, we see a worldwide culture in which forgiveness, whether for errors, injustices, or debts, is the norm. This is part of the vision that is, more briefly said, a world that works for everyone. A world where forgiveness is the norm. You know, the norm is what we expect you to do, what it is natural for you to do, or what is it appropriate for you to do. So the norm is like driving on the right-hand side of the road in this country. That's a norm. That's what we expect in order to get along. So what would it be? What would a world be like if forgiveness was the norm? If it was what we spontaneously did? If it was what we expected ourselves to do and found ourselves surrounded by? What would the world be like? What would you be like in such a world? Well, the story I'm about to tell you gave me a glimpse of what that world might be like. The title of this talk is The Courage to be Forgiving. And when I was preparing it, I thought of a story that actually I witnessed part of because I was living in that part of the world at the time. But it took place on the island of Guam, and it was discovered that 30 years after World War II ended, there was still a Japanese soldier living in the jungles of Guam who did not know that the war was over, apparently, who continued to fight the war, who continued to steal batteries, he didn't have a weapon, so he couldn't shoot anybody, and he didn't particularly attack, but he clearly was out there to mess with things. And they tried everything on Guam, once they identified what was going on, to bring him out of the jungle, but he wouldn't come. They sent people speaking in Japanese, even brought in people from Japan, saying, hi, I'm a government officer, you can come out now. He didn't believe it. No, that's the Americans fooling him. So it just didn't work. You can just see it, yelling with bullhorns, walking through the jungle. He's not coming out. So when I remembered this story, it made me wonder, maybe it'll make you wonder, what wars am I still fighting that have long since ended? What wars, in fact, am I really engaged in as if they were current battles, but actually are no longer going on in any other place than in my head or in my emotions? Recently, I found yet another internal war. I kind of find them over time. And this internal war is about not just my not forgiving somebody. It was that I didn't want to forgive them. There was no way I was going to forgive that person. And I'd been working with them for 10 years or more, but I just did not see a way to forgive them, nor did I want to see. Their behavior was obvious, egregious, obnoxious, unconscious. If we went to court, you'd all agree with me. And then I began to notice something. I began to notice that whenever this person's name was brought up, I went into this internal whirlpool, this vortex of an internal conversation, argument with the person involved, with people who might support her, etc. It just went on and on. My mind was taken over with endless arguments. And I discovered that I was living in a prison of not forgiving, a prison built of anger, frustration, and outrage. And I felt trapped. I didn't know how to get out of this dilemma. I know I'm a minister of science of mind. I know you got to forgive. But I wasn't willing to. And so I didn't want to leave my prison. I didn't want to get out of jail, if you will. If it meant that I have to give up my grievances and forgive that person. In fact, I put together a top 10 list. Now, I'm sure you could all make your own top 10 list. And if you want to give me suggestions, you can later. But this is my top 10 list of reasons not to forgive. So the first one is, I always have something to talk about. Although on occasion I may need to find a new audience, nonetheless, I've always got something to talk about. And inside, number 9, I always have something to think about. I'm never bored. You know, who needs a novel when you can chew on your grievances? Okay. And number 8, I always have something to bond with others about. You notice how people are ready to support you in your grievances? And number 7, they do support you in your grievances. You've always got somebody telling you you're right. That's always good to be affirmed that way. Number 6, I always know what to do in any situation. Blame the one I don't forgive. Blame someone else. Number 5, I'm always right. Right. Number 4, actually it proves that I'm deserving of love because I'm so hurt. So it's kind of like, oh, okay, oh, you poor boy. Number 3, I really feel powerful. I don't know, I know it doesn't actually do anything to the other person, or at least in my imagination, I don't know that actually. I imagine that it hurts them. It's hurting me. Number 2, I never have to say I'm sorry because I really don't have to look at what I'm doing in this. And number 1 of the top 10 reasons is I don't have to give up my story. My story about what that person is, my story about who I am. In fact, if I have to give up my story, if I had to give it up in order to get out of jail, to abandon my sense of what's right and what's wrong, and let them get away with their obvious and unconscious behavior, I don't think I'd want to do that. I'd rather stay in that self-imposed prison. I'd rather stay in the jungle than give them the satisfaction of my forgiveness and allow them to continue to torment me. So perhaps the question for me at that moment is not the courage to be forgiven, but the courage to be free. Do I want to step out into freedom, or do I want to continue to chew on the bars of my cage? It seemed like the only way I could forgive would be through some kind of miracle. That would free me from this trap. And I don't know how to make it happen. I didn't know. But then I remembered that one of the central teachings of A Course in Miracles, which is a spiritual practice that I'm engaged in, was that, simply put, miracles, which change your perception and experience of the world, come through the practice of forgiveness. In a quote from Kenneth Wapnick, an editor of the Course, he speaks about forgiveness as a miracle. A miracle is something you can't create. A miracle happens, but you can invite it. So, he says, we are not the ones who could shift our perception from the ego to the miracle. That's the role of the Holy Spirit. That's the role of God. That's the role of the rest of you in our own teaching. When I say the rest of you, who you are is who you imagine yourself to be and more. You are infinitely more than you imagine yourself to be. You are what you have been calling God. But that's the role of God, to change your perception from the ego's point of view to the miracle. All that we can do is to choose the miracle instead of the ego. That is what the Course refers to when it speaks of the little willingness. The Course teaches I can't forgive on my own, not with the self I imagine myself to be. That I need to step out of my self-definition into that larger being which I am, which we call God, which we call Spirit, which we call reality in this teaching. And I need that to produce, to bring forth forgiveness in me. And total willingness is not required. Oh, that was good news. In fact, the Course says you won't have total willingness, but you need to have some willingness, a little willingness. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get into these kind of dilemmas, I use a little phrase that seems to help me. So I'm not willing to forgive. Am I willing to be willing to forgive? No, not yet. Am I willing to be willing to be willing? And eventually I can get to a willing that works. And then the whole thing clears out, by the way. Are you willing to be willing to be willing to be willing? That's all you need. It says a total willingness. It does not say a lot. It also teaches us, the Course that is, that if we had a lot of willingness, then we would not need the Holy Spirit. Okay. So the rest of what we need is given by God, the Holy Spirit. But you have to give up your idea that you know what you are and what you can and can't do. And just simply focus on the willingness. So maybe now we shift the title of this talk from the courage to be forgiving to the courage to be free to now the courage to be willing to be free. Actually, I was going to base this whole talk about the difficulty of being willing. I'll let you make up that talk in your mind. Really, the courage to be willing to accept help. And the Course instructs us that indeed we do not need to seek to forgive, but to seek to find what is blocking our forgiveness. You and I are naturally forgiving beings. We are, in fact, the expression of the only being there is, which is God, and God is love. That is our nature. So we don't need to seek to forgive. What we need to seek is what is blocking our forgiveness. Your task is not to seek, but to find all the barriers within yourself which you've built against it. It's not necessary to seek for what is true, but it is necessary to seek for what is false in you. So let's go back to the story of the Japanese soldier. And they finally found his former commanding officer. And they brought him back from Japan, and they, retailored his uniform so he could wear it again 30 years later. I can just see that. And they sent him out into the clearing, and he called out the soldier, and the soldier came out. And at this moment, it's very powerful teaching what the man is reported to have done. He said, "Tell me about your experiences. Tell me about your comrades. Tell me what was going on for you." And in that activity, the colonel was doing something that was very important, because he was honoring in that man the man's intention. He was very aware, I'm sure, that what the guy was doing was crazy, mistaken, misguided, not helpful. But he was at the same time speaking to the heart of that man, speaking to what it was moving him, listening to it. And he listened to the man, to the soldier, with tears in his eyes. The colonel was enacting another Course in Miracles teaching that says that every act that anybody does is either an act of love or a call for love. So let's acknowledge The soldiers' actions were misguided. We're not celebrating misguided actions, misguided attempts to express love. What we're honoring is the desire to know love. What we're doing is saying, I see that. And we're saying at the same time, this isn't working. So we do not have to allow people to, in their misguided attempts to know love, to damage us. If somebody doesn't know they can't break my arm, then they need to be put in a place where they can't break my arm or your arm. But if we do that and at the same time say, hey, you're an arm breaker, therefore you are a demon, you are a force of evil, two things happen. One is you live in a world in which evil is alive. And number two, you find yourself in a world in which that person will never hear what you have to say. Never. So the first barrier in forgiving is to ignore the love, ignore the energy, ignore the intention of the person. You know, it's hard to see that sometimes. It's hard to see it in others, but it's even harder to see it in yourself. To see that you are acting on love, to see that you have mistakes that you have made that deserve forgiveness. It's hard to see someone as forgivable if you don't see yourself as forgivable. Do you, in fact, hold your mistakes against you? Do you live in an internal world where you have done things that are so bad that you can no longer expect to receive forgiveness, that you can no longer give it to yourself? That's the barrier you have to remove. Do you have a little willingness to learn something different about yourself? Because when you learn to forgive the other person, you learn to forgive yourself. You can't do one without the other. The original sin, as it's described in Christianity, is now about to be redescribed here. The original sin is the sin of telling yourself you are something that in fact you are not. What you really are, as the poet Rumi continually says, what you really are cannot be put into words. But whatever God is, you are completely. And God is love. Ernest Holmes, the founder of our teaching, wrote about the consequences of holding past mistakes against you. And he said, if one labors under a great burden of past mistakes, he devitalizes his body, and if the condemnation is great enough, it might rend the body incapable of moving. Jesus, seeing that the sick man was laboring under a load of condemnation, told him that his sins were forgiven. This removed the weight from the man's consciousness, making it possible for him to receive the healing word. What weight do you need to have lifted? Right now. That's in fact what God is wanting you to know. We have to be a little willing to hear that message. So going back to that clearing, the colonel didn't tell the man right away that the war was over. He just gave him new orders. He said, come with me back to Japan. We're doing other things. And the soldier trusted his colonel and did what he said willingly. So I ask you, who do you or who would you listen willingly to? The Course in Miracles says that there are only two voices in you at any time. One is the voice for truth, the voice for love, same one, or the voice for fear. And you can always tell the difference. The voice for truth is also the voice for love. The voice for truth doesn't see a need for forgiveness, but offers it anyway if you want it. The voice for love never brings you turmoil or struggle or condemnation or judgment, but only the persistent recognition of your love. You listen to that voice willingly. You don't listen when somebody is condemning you. So, the soldier goes back to Japan, and there are parades for him. There are heroes welcome. And this isn't just about Yay, Japan. It's really about people saying, we understand what you were trying to do. We want to honor that. And there I got a glimpse of what a world where forgiveness is the norm might be like. I got a sense that the world where your intention to love is seen and recognized, for that is the spontaneous and natural response of your being. The courage to be willing then turns into courage to trust that your intent to love will be seen and given true recognition, even if you don't quite believe it yourself. So trust, a nice acronym. Trust means to rely upon Spirit totally. The news that I'm giving here is that you can't forgive. You can't work it up so you could forgive. What you can do is say, I'm willing to know forgiveness, to be forgiveness, and ask to have that given to you, to arise within you, to rely upon Spirit totally. So in this teaching, what do we trust? We trust the reality that God, reality itself, sees us as we really are and loves what it sees. We trust and have faith that we will be given what we need to know, what we need to do, and the ability, skill, and yes, even the willingness to do it. Emma Curtis Hopkins, an important teacher in this tradition, and we will be having a class taught by Reverend Ruth Barnhart about Emma later this summer, told us to use this affirmation. The I am means God in this case, the I am works inevitably through me to will and to do that which ought to be done by me. And if you're comfortable, I'll ask you to repeat after me. The I am works inevitably through me to will and to do that which ought to be done by me. That's where we are to be in our lives. To let that greater one that we are come through. It looks like it's God outside, but it's actually just the rest of you wanting to be known. The function of our treatment, our practice of prayer, which we call treatment, is to bring us into being willing to live in this world, because we describe the world that is God's world. It's the world that all great spiritual traditions give us. I asked in the beginning of this talk, what would you be like in a world where forgiveness is the norm? I would say this. You would have everything you need to forgive, everything you need to be free, everything you need to be willing and trusting in all you do. This is a world in which forgiveness is the norm. This is a world in which your love is seen and recognized and responded to in everything you do. Please join me in prayer. There is only this moment, And each one here is now aware of that within each one that is now turning its attention to hearing these words. Turning our attention within, we are aware of the one who is turning, and we know that to be the divine one itself, for there is only one actor, only one mind, only one activity, and it's taking place as the very center of each one here. We rest in this place. This is the place where everything is given to be able to understand, enact, release, allow, be willing. So I speak this word to that one as each one here now. And I accept that we are now being given a new way of knowing and loving our life, a new way of being fully present to all that occurs, of being fully present with our hearts, to recognize the proof, the truth that love is the only energy, the only activity. That's what we are. That's what we will find ourselves to be in greater and greater clarity in every moment. And I accept that for each one of us. And I simply release this word now, knowing that it is done by the one who is hearing it. With gratitude, with joy, I allow it to be. And so it is.